We appreciate so much the outpour that we've had from Village Bible Church and our members to be engaged in actively training and learning how to defend our pro-life stand. As I've mentioned a couple times in our leadership meetings, that this is a church, a Protestant church in a community that is really trying to raise the bar for other Protestant churches, but also trying to carve the way, because many of us aren't as involved in the pro-life industry, in the movement, as we should be. So we're wanting to see this church. We have several other churches that are watching us and wanting to develop and model a pro-life ministry after ours. So we're excited to sort of sickle the way a little bit in our community for that. And I'm also very excited to have Mary Kate Knorr here tonight and her team from the Illinois Right to Life. Mary Kate is, wait till you hear her. She's absolutely outstanding and energetic, and she's going to have y'all engaged. So, but before I do that, I'm going to invite Ralph Riviera. He is one of our own here from our church. He's he's a member here from our church, and he also works as a lobbyist in Springfield. He's one of two lobbyists that are pro-life down in the Springfield area, so he is fighting for life, sort of on his own sometimes, uphill battle, and keeping us all informed in here. He also happens to work with Illinois Right to Life, which is where Mary Kate is the executive director. He's going to come up and open us up in a word of prayer and give us a little insight as to who we have here tonight. Before we get started on that, hold on just a second. Before we get started on that, I just want to do a little bit of business. We have sign-up sheets in the back that we'd like for everybody to make sure that they sign up. This will give you an opportunity to stay engaged with what's happening with Illinois Right to Life. Things happen like this in Illinois. So when you get those rapid emails from Illinois Right to Life, it's probably because something pretty serious is going on and they need a call to action right then. So please don't just scroll by those emails when you get them. Look them up, open them up, and figure out what's going on. And sometimes we'll be sending them out from Village also. Also, October is a very busy month, and we want to add one more thing to that. Village Bible has chosen to host an entire day of prayer at Planned Parenthood in Aurora. So we are the team that's going to be supporting prayer October 15th. It's a Tuesday. It's coming up. I will be the day captain for the whole day out there, and we'll be out there from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. trying to fill in that every hour where we can have a group of people coming out there to pray. What is the importance of being out there to pray? Many women see those prayer warriors and know they are being the ones prayed for, and they turn away and they choose not to go into Planned Parenthood to get that abortion that's scheduled for that day. I myself am one of those that caught the eye of a prayer warrior and decided in that day to choose life for my son Nicholas, and he's now one of our youth pastors here. So it's really important to be out there and pray. Praying when you're not at Planned Parenthood is equally as important, but being there and being a presence is also very important. So we have a sign-up sheet. We're going to have that available at the end. We already have some people who are signing up for it too. And you can come out in groups. You don't have to feel like you need to go out there alone. We can come out in groups together. And join me out there for a word of prayer. And we'll also have some prayer guidelines that you have that you're going to be out there, so you won't be trying to figure out what am I supposed to do, what am I supposed to be praying for. Ralph, if you could come up and open us up in a word of prayer. We appreciate everybody being here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. If you'll join me in prayer. Heavenly Father, we want to ask your blessing on this gathering, that you would bless Mary Kate, give her the voice, the words that will inspire us all, that will energize us so that we will serve you, Lord, so that we will stand for the unborn and for those at the end of life. So we ask your blessing here. Bless our conversation, bless our travels back home. We ask this in Jesus' name and for his sake. Amen. So Mary Kate, as Michelle said, is just 2 years in with Illinois Right to Life and Illinois Right to Life Action. She's a dynamic young woman who is really moving our organization, and our organization was well established, but moving it even farther and better and with more resources. She is the executive director of Illinois Right to Life, and we have Illinois Right to Life Action, which is the lobbying group, sends me and one other lobbyist, Molly, to the state capitol. And she is our spokesman when we have matters of the press or people who want to contact us. So, and over there is Steve Jacobs. He's a new member of Illinois Right to Life, and he's our program manager. And so he's got many degrees and all kinds of pride. So we're happy to have him, a very strong advocate for life. So without any more, let me invite Mary Kay. Mary Kay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having us. We're so excited to be here. This is the 6th of the Pro-Life Training Tour, is what we're calling it. So we launched this tour. We came up with the idea at the beginning of the summer, and sort of in response to the bill that passed in the spring. And this is now our 6th event. It's been a whirlwind the last 3 weeks. Steve and I have been going to all these different locations. I was in Champaign on Tuesday, which I feel like I'm still recovering from that. So, but hey, I shouldn't even talk about long drives because Ralph does that every day some weeks. So. Yeah, so it's been so exciting. It's been so awesome to, really meet and connect face to face with so many pro-life people across the state who are concerned about these bills, concerned about what we're seeing. Some of you, I'm sure, heard yesterday that they announced that a new Planned Parenthood, they've been secretly building this facility down on the Illinois-Missouri border, and I'll get into a little bit of that as well, what that sort of means for our state and also in the national context, how we perceive the abortion industry is using us to serve their larger agenda. So what we'll do today is, this is going to be about 2 hours roughly. We've been pretty good about staying on time, depending on questions and things like that at the end. But the first hour, what we'll do is we'll go through what we call a human approach to having a conversation about abortion. And the key here is that we want you to walk away from this not with the ability necessarily to do what we see like on Facebook when there's college students sitting at a table and they're talking to total strangers on their campus about abortion, and it's kind of a contentious thing. That's not necessarily what we want you to feel prepared to do. What we really want you to feel prepared for is to start having conversations about abortion with people that you already have an established relationship with. So I'm sure every single one of us in this room have those people in our lives that we can think of, friends, family, coworkers, whoever they may be, who don't feel the same as us on this issue. And those are the people, those are the hearts that we can really begin to convert because we already have an established relationship of trust with those people in our lives. Dan Proft, some of you may listen to him on AM 560. He's a good friend of our organization. He does a lot to help us, and he said something at an event recently that has really stuck with me, that the pro-choice side has convinced us that no one ever changes their mind on this issue. But people change their mind on this issue every single day. I mean, we can look at the list. Vernon Nathanson, Dr. Anthony Levatino, Norma McCorvey, who's Jane Roe herself in Roe v. Wade. The list truly goes on and on of all of these very active pro-choice advocates who eventually made their way over to the pro-life side when their eyes were open to the truth of the situation. And so that's what we need to do. And as pro-life people in the state, where we need to begin is in our own lives and our own networks. We need to start really making an effort to have these conversations. And even, to take that even a step further, we need to start recognizing the opportunities that God is placing in front of us that we aren't taking out of fear or, the feeling that we're inequipped or some of these other things. So I'll begin. There are two primary goals that we have with this training tour and with each of these events individually. The first is each of you as individuals, like I sort of already expressed, we want everyone to leave feeling like they're not only equipped with the ability to have this conversation, so we'll walk you through a way that you can actually go step by step through a conversation with someone about abortion. So not only are you equipped with the skill and the ability to actually have that conversation, you're also equipped with the information. So we'll go through the 5 most common arguments that we often hear in response to our pro-life stance, and then we'll give you some responses that you can give to, push back on those pro-choice arguments that we hear. So that's the first goal, and that's the goal for each of you as an individual, so that you can go out and have these conversations with people that you already have an established relationship with. And then the second goal is a goal for all of us collectively as a pro-life movement in the state of Illinois. And the key here is that we all need to get on the same page. And that's certainly not to say that we haven't been successful at that in the past. I think we saw historic success in the spring when we were responding to these bills. But the key is that we need to grow this movement, and we need to really organize so that we can move forward as a machine all on the same page, all together, and continue to make that same impact. So the key here is that we want to connect with you. We want you to connect with us. We want you to get on our newsletter list, connected with us so that you're coming to us for resources, things like that. And then at the same time, we want to be able to reach out to you when Ralph comes back from Springfield and says, there's this bill, we have an opportunity to fight it, here's how we do that. We can deliver that information to you, but we need to first all be connected. So this is helpful for that. And it's also helpful, I think, for all of you together to sit down in the room and recognize these are the other pro-life activists in my immediate community, and these are the people that can support me and that I can support as we move forward in this effort. So that's really the goal here. So the goal is twofold. It's each of us as individuals, we leave this room feeling like I am equipped to have a compassionate civil conversation with people I already have a relationship with about abortion. And then on the other hand, as a group, it's let's move forward together as a machine so that we can continue to fight this and we can continue to change hearts and minds in the state of Illinois. So those are the goals. So we'll start first with the human approach. And if you look at the bags that you have in front of you, there are 2 sheets of paper. One has 2 bodies of text that are numbered lists. And the first is a human approach. It's 5 steps. So we'll go through that really quick. And this is a suggested method that we have put together based on a lot of study and research about different suggestions that different pro-life activists make about how to have a conversation about abortion. We believe that in order for us to convince another person that the human being inside the womb is worthy of compassion, we have to first show that we're willing to show them that same compassion and that same respect and that same empathy. So first and foremost, the first step that we encourage everyone to take when you find yourself in a conversation about abortion with someone who does not agree with you is ask questions to actually understand where they're coming from. So I think this is important for 2 reasons. On the one hand, when we find that we are now in a conversation about abortion with someone who is pro-choice, we need to take a step back and slow down, because our heart rate goes up and we start thinking about what are all the things that I can say to convince this person that it is a life inside the womb and that we have a duty to protect it. And so we start thinking and we're coming up with arguments in our head and trying to gather all this information that we have in there that's knocking around about pro-life and embryos and fetuses and all these other things. And we need to take a step back and slow down. And we need to stop and try to understand this person across from us. So the first key here is ask questions to understand this person. Why are you pro-choice? Why do you feel that it's an absolute necessity that a woman have access to abortion? Have you had an experience that has made you feel like this is something that a woman needs? What was that experience? There's a lot of different ways that we can frame this. And a key here, and I'll just add as sort of a side note, this tour experience has already been very important for me because I've had the opportunity to talk to people again who are on the ground in these communities and really living pro-life ministry. It was just on Saturday of this week, Steve and I were at an event in Arlington Heights, and we met a woman who started pro-life ministry at her church 3 or 4 years ago. And during that time, she has already met 50 women who are post-abortive in their church community alone. And something that a post-abortive woman, a separate conversation, something that a friend of ours once told me, who she herself is post-abortive, she said that when she started to come back from being a hardcore pro-choice activist, and she started to come into the Christian church, and she started to acknowledge that maybe my abortion actually has been a problem for me in my life. Everywhere she went in her church community, she heard people talking about their drinking problems and the violence that they were experiencing at home and all of these other issues, and she never heard anyone talk about abortion. And that was a struggle for her because she wanted someone else to say it so that she felt like she could say it. So I think in these conversations, and this is especially important when we're asking questions, when we're really taking, I would say, the first 2 steps here, is that we have to remember that this person across from us might actually have a personal experience with abortion. Maybe they experienced one, maybe they themselves have had an abortion, maybe they have a family member who's had an abortion. We'll talk a little bit later on about how men are affected by abortion as well. And men oftentimes carry that wound in a deeper and more profound way than the women, because it's unrecognized in a lot of instances. So that's something to consider here, especially when we're asking questions to understand this person. The goal is to really build empathy and compassion and understand exactly where it is they're coming from. The second step here, I'll put this up on the second step here is really to actively listen to what they're saying. So again, even when we're asking questions, we can find ourselves asking, and then the second the other person starts talking, we're thinking about what we're going to say next. And we have to show this person that we're actually listening to them. This is a little bit of a psychological tactic, and I certainly don't want to give the impression that any of this is not authentic or not genuine, because the key is to build compassion and empathy for this other person. But there is a little bit of a psychological tool here that when the other person in a conversation recognizes that we're actually listening and internalizing what they're saying, we're nodding our heads, we're asking follow-up questions, we're really showing that we're engaged in what they're saying, there's a level of trust that's built in that interaction. So that's something that we have to acknowledge there, is that if we can build this level of trust in this conversation, this person will be more likely to share with us and also more likely to listen to us and to internalize what we have to say when it comes time to have that conversation. So that's the second step, is listen, and the goal here is really to build empathy for this person and to continue to understand why they are pro-choice or why they believe what they believe about abortion. The third step here is to find some common ground. There is a funny anecdote, I guess is what you would call it, that I like to share at this point. So President Obama spoke at Notre Dame in 2015, and during his remarks, he talked about common ground between the pro-life movement and the pro-choice movement. Now, what he said, I think maybe some pro-choicers would not necessarily agree with him, but he said that we have to acknowledge as common ground between the two of us that there is a spiritual and a moral dimension to the abortion decision. So I don't know, I think a lot of pro-choicers would maybe deny that that's the case. Nevertheless, I think we can happily take that, well, if President Obama said it, maybe we can, trust that that's something we should suggest to them. Nevertheless, I think that's a good example of how can we build some common ground? How can we say, okay, here's something we can agree on. Michelle knows that one of the things we can agree on with the pro-choice movement is that we care about the women. We want to help the women. And that's a key here. And the difference between us and them is that we know that abortion is inherently wrong and bad for women. We know that. Of course, the common ground here is that we want to support the women and we want to help the women. And the woman is an important person in this conversation. So that's another example. A third example might be, we often hear, and again, we'll talk about it more later on, but we often hear the rape and incest exception. And the rape common ground that we can always find is that it is a horrible tragedy when a woman is raped. And this is entirely genuine and entirely authentic that is how we feel. It is a horrible, horrible tragedy when a woman is raped, and it is equally difficult when, as a result of that rape, she finds that she's conceived a child. That's something we can all agree on. So once we find that common ground, and again, there is a little bit of a tool to be found here in that when we get this other person to agree with us and acknowledge that, okay, there's something here that we can see eye to eye on, they're a little bit more receptive to what it is we have to say. So we're not coming from this polarizing aspect that suddenly we're on two opposite sides and we're just pitted against each other. Now we really are beginning to find some of the middle ground that we can say, okay, well, we're both coming from the same place, so let's work forward from there. So that's the third step, is to find common ground. So we have ask questions to understand, listen, actively listen, and find some common ground with this person. The fourth element here is ask some more questions, but to make this person think about what it is they're defending. So it's a funny thing with the abortion message. Even the word abortion, it doesn't really elicit what it is we're actually talking about. What are we talking about? We're talking about killing a child, a living baby inside of the womb. So when you say the word abortion, it's sort of benign. It doesn't really elicit any emotion or necessarily any thought about that. So we can use questions as a tool to sort of lead people through a line of logic that they have to actually think about this. What is an abortion? What does it mean to terminate a pregnancy? What does it mean to be pregnant? Well, what is a fetus? Explain, what you think a fetus is. What do you think happens during an abortion procedure? And of course we have to be discerning about some of these questions, but I think that if we actually ask some of these things in an authentic way, we'll get this person thinking and maybe plant some seeds in them that they actually start thinking about things that they have not thought about before. What is an abortion? What does it mean to terminate a pregnancy? Some of these other things. So the first step, again, ask questions to understand. The second is actively listen to what this person is saying. The third is find some common ground. The fourth is ask questions to make him or her think about what they're defending when they defend abortion. And the goal here is really to challenge them to view the reality of abortion in a different frame of mind. And then the fifth and really the final step is to tell the truth. So once we've done all of this, we've built this rapport with this person, we've listened to them, we've discovered their point of view, we've built some compassion and empathy for them. There comes a point in the conversation that all there is left for us to do is to simply deliver the truth. And this is a moment that, so Illinois Right to Life, we're a secular organization. We're not affiliated with a religious denomination of any kind. But everyone who works for us is Christian. And I think we can all recognize that the Christian church is really a leader in the pro-life movement. And so something for me that I suggest for people at this point, and this is something that I've made a practice of, and it has served me fairly well, I think, is whenever I find myself in a conversation, either about abortion or even an event like this, I always invite the Holy Spirit into the conversation. Because the Holy Spirit knows that person's heart far better than I could ever know it. And I might say things that I leave and I'm like, why did I even say that? But for all we know, I planted a seed, or we planted a seed that will change that person's heart in 5 or 10 years, but it maybe just took that long for that to flourish. So I always invite the Holy Spirit into the conversation. I'd encourage you to do the same. And then I think at that point we have to just trust that if we plant the seed, if we do our duty to just deliver that truth, that's all we can do, and we have to move forward faithfully. And I would add as well that one of the reasons that we encourage all of you to start thinking about people in your lives that you know are pro-choice or defend abortion or maybe are post-abortive themselves, that maybe you think God is calling you to have this conversation with them, recognize that it's not necessarily just one conversation. Sometimes these people need to be walked with on this journey. And I think that many of the pro-choice activists who turned pro-life, I think they would all agree that it really is a journey. It is a discernment of its own. You are experiencing a conversion in a certain sense. And so I think that that's what we have to be prepared for, is that first conversation might be really difficult and it might be painful. But if we invite the Holy Spirit in and we deliver truth and we're compassionate and empathetic, we might open up some space that we can walk with them on this journey that they find themselves in a much different place in 5 or 10 years. And that's really how we change hearts and minds in a state like Illinois. So those are the 5 steps to the human approach, which is what we call it, a human approach. So ask questions to understand, listen, actively listen to this other person, find common ground with them and get them to agree with something that you say. Ask questions to make them think about what it is they're defending. And then finally, just tell the truth. Just let the truth loose and God will do the rest. So at this point, what we'll do, sorry, this keeps going on, it's my computer. At this point, what we'll do, I think it's important to go through the actual abortion procedures so that people actually know and understand what happens in an abortion procedure. So I don't think we have any young kids in the room. Every once in a while there's a young kid. There's no images or anything like that, so nothing to be concerned about there, but I am going to describe what actually happens. And I think this is important for us to know as pro-lifers. I do say that I wouldn't necessarily encourage you to go straight to this information when you're having a conversation with someone about abortion. I think we have to be discerning about that. Sometimes people just aren't ready. So we have to, like I said, we have to be discerning about that. But all that said, I think this is important information for us to know and for us to hear. So the first abortion procedure that we'll talk about it's in the first trimester is when it occurs. It's the first 10 weeks. It's called the RU486 abortion pill. That's what it's called, RU486 or the abortion pill. This is a medical abortion, and as I said, it happens in the first 10 weeks of pregnancy. In this procedure, the mother ingests a pill at the abortion clinic, and what this pill does is it blocks progesterone, which is a hormone that's used by the mother's body to sustain the baby, specifically through the uterus during pregnancy. So once progesterone is blocked, the uterine wall starts to break down, that tissue starts to break down, and the baby's blood supply and nutrient supply is cut off as a result of that breakdown of that tissue. So after a day or two, the baby will die, and the woman will take a second pill that will forcibly expel the baby. So she'll, it will appear like a miscarriage, but this is a painful and an often long process for these women. I use the example of, if any of you saw the movie Unplanned with Abby Johnson, she talks about this. This is abortion experience that she had. And the abortionist will tell you that it's only a few days that you'll experience some bleeding. She bled for numerous weeks after she took this medication. So this is certainly not the easy procedure that they want you to believe. And this is, again, RU486, the abortion pill is what this is called. There is an abortion reversal pill that can be taken within a small time frame, within about 24 hours. If the woman changes her mind, she can take an abortion pill reversal. And it's been very effective. We hear about it a lot in the media that, the pro-choice media is very critical of it's not been approved, it's not regulated, all these other things, but they say those things because it works. So.
I'm sorry, before the second pill?
Yes, before the second pill. Yeah. So the woman changes her mind, and hopefully if you catch it quick enough, there have been plenty of healthy babies that have been delivered after this has happened. Yeah. I also mentioned here, just in the last few, I've started mentioning this because I saw an article on Facebook about how the pro-choice movement right now is trying to conflate RU486, the abortion pill, with the morning after pill, with Plan B. And the two are very different, yeah. So Plan B, a lot of college campuses now have Plan B available in vending machines on campus, which is upsetting by its own right, and Plan B is a little bit different. What Plan B does is it stops the embryo from impacting itself or embedding itself in the woman's womb, so it eventually dies because it doesn't actually embed itself there. RU486 both kill the embryo, but RU486, the embryo is already in the woman's womb, embedded in the woman's womb, and it breaks down that uterine tissue. So RU486 is, granted, both are dangerous, both we don't advocate for. RU486 is much different. It's not something that a woman should be able to get out of a vending machine. And we have things like telemedicine abortions now where a woman can actually video chat a doctor and receive a prescription for this medication from her home. A lot of rural communities are experiencing this, that they don't have an abortion clinic nearby, so they have access to telemedicine and they're able to get a prescription for this medication. And this is a very dangerous thing. Women experience, heavy bleeding, as I said. There can be other damage to her uterus as a result, and it's a dangerous procedure. It's not just a pill the way that they describe it.
How do they confirm viability for that?
Yeah.
They're not even confirming viability of a pregnancy at that point.
Absolutely.
So they could not even be pregnant, just missed a period.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. And to be honest, I'm not sure. I don't know that.
They don't.
Yeah, they don't. Exactly. Yeah. So it's just through video.
Those are rhetorical questions.
Yeah. They don't, yes. So that's the first, is RU486. That's up to 10 weeks in the first trimester. The second abortion procedure that we'll talk about is the suction abortion procedure, or a D&C is what it's called, an aspiration. Oh, I'm sorry. That's my computer. So the suction abortion occurs between 5 and 13 weeks typically. What happens here is this is a surgical abortion procedure. The abortionist uses metal rods or medication to dilate the mother's cervix. Once he's dilated her cervix a little bit, he inserts up the cervix a small suction catheter, and he turns the suction catheter on. The suction catheter has about 10 to 20 times the power of a household vacuum. And he sucks out the contents of the womb. So the baby's alive when this happens. Sucks out the contents of the womb into a container outside of the woman's body, at which point sometimes what will happen is either a technician or the doctor will take those contents out and separate them out on a tray to see, is there any major pieces missing, anything like that. At that point, he'll take a separate tool, sharp metal tool, and he'll insert it into the cervix, and he'll scrape the sides of the uterine wall to make sure that there's no big pieces of tissue left, because that can cause infection and other complications. Sometimes when he's scraping the uterine wall, that's when women experience other types of injury, perforation of the uterus, or just in general damage to the uterine wall, and this can cause problems for her later on when she is trying to get pregnant again or trying to sustain a pregnancy in the future. And again, so this is called a suction abortion. Very painful. The woman does feel it. She does hear that sound, and we hear a lot of women after they have an abortion like this, they have trouble being around a suction sound in general. It's really traumatizing for them. I was just talking to someone yesterday that she knew a woman who couldn't go to the dentist because she was so terrified of hearing that sucking sound that they use to suck the water out of your mouth. So, I think we hear things like that, women having flashbacks as a result of different details of the day. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember and point to when people say that women aren't actually affected by abortion. This is something that they live with for the rest of their lives. So that's a section, abortion and D&C. I would additionally add, when we're talking about a D&C, there is a form of a D&C procedure that is performed after a woman has a miscarriage. So sometimes if the baby naturally dies in a woman's body and the doctor has to remove the baby, has to remove that tissue, sometimes a D&C will be performed on her for her safety. The baby is already dead at that point. And again, this is an example of something that we see the pro-choice movement. There are some legislators in Springfield who conflate the two, and they say that, I had a D&C or so-and-so had a D&C. A D&C as a result of a miscarriage and a D&C abortion are two very different things. We're talking about willfully killing the child as opposed to clearing out the woman's womb after the tragedy of having a miscarriage, which is a very, very different event. The next procedure is in the second trimester of D&E. This is the dilation and evacuation surgical abortion. This is between 13 and 24 weeks. My sister is 22 weeks pregnant right now, so this is very real for me. We're finding out the gender of her baby tomorrow, which is really exciting. But so second trimester is D&E. And essentially what happens here is the abortionist dilates the woman's cervix, and then he inserts a larger suction catheter, a little bit larger than the one we saw in the suction abortion procedure. This catheter is actually used to suck out the amniotic fluid around the baby. And then once he's emptied the woman's womb of amniotic fluid, he'll take a Sofer clamp. It's a clamp with sharp teeth on it. And he'll put the clamp up into her cervix, and he'll take the baby out piece by piece. So again, the baby's alive when this happens. He'll take a leg or an arm. And then once everything has been removed except for the head's usually too big to fit out of the woman's cervix as a full piece at this point. So he'll either use that Sofer clamp or he'll use another type of tool to go in and compact the skull, break the skull so that it's small enough to fit it through the cervix. And then he goes in again with the scraping to make sure that he got everything. And this is called a dilation and evacuation procedure. This is a D&E abortion, 13 to 24 weeks. I think, so my sister is a NICU nurse, and she said that they consider viability in the NICU to be about 23 weeks. So this is potentially the type that could be done on a preemie baby. I think the earliest that we've heard ever, maybe, that a baby's lived is at 21 weeks. So the next that we mention is a DNX down here. It's after 20 weeks. A DNX is a dilation and extraction abortion. This is also called a partial birth abortion. Interesting thing, because this was kind of I don't know, Ralph, maybe you would know better. I feel like this was a dead issue for a while, and now I've been seeing things in the last couple of days. I just saw that Planned Parenthood posted something explaining that a partial birth abortion is not what we say a partial birth abortion is. So dilation and extraction of DNX, essentially what happens here, this is a surgical procedure. It's after 20 weeks, so the baby's usually viable, almost viable. What will happen is the abortionist will dilate the woman's cervix and then pull the fetus through her cervix feet first. So the baby's still alive. The head of the baby is still inside of the woman's womb, or still inside of her, but the baby's body is outside of her body. And at this point, what will happen is the doctor will puncture the head and compress the skull. So sometimes he'll use the suction catheter to remove the contents of the skull. But again, the goal here is to to make the baby's head small enough so that it can fit through the cervix. And this is, partial birth abortion, it's one of those things that I tell people, what would be wrong with this? So this is illegal at the federal level. Partial birth abortion is illegal at the federal level. At the state level, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe they lifted the ban on partial birth abortion as part of the RHA. Is that right?
The federal court struck down our partial birth abortion ban many years ago, so we don't have it.
Okay.
But federally,
It's not effective.
we have it if you cross state lines or
Right.
cross, it's the Commerce Clause they use, because they can't tell states what to do. They say if you cross a state line to perform a partial birth abortion or to get a partial, then the federal law comes into place. Or if you buy equipment It's pretty extensive, so it can cover a lot. But we don't have it specifically in Illinois. A federal judge struck it down.
Okay, so we have no ban on partial birth abortion
Right.
in Illinois?
We have to
Okay.
rely on the federal.
The federal-
laws and state lines.
Okay, okay.
situation.
So Ralph is the real expert. This is an intense one for me because if I'm wrong, Ralph knows. So he's the real expert. Okay, yes, thank you. So partial birth abortion is illegal at the federal level when it comes to crossing state lines. But here in the state of Illinois, that's not necessarily the case. So the question that I sort of pose for people here is what would be wrong with partial birth abortion relative to all of the other procedures we've talked about, other than the fact that now you can see the baby? You know, I'm not really sure what else. You can see the baby, it's alive, it's outside of the woman's womb. There was CNN did a report and they interviewed an abortionist who's a pretty famous abortionist just a couple weeks ago, and the abortionist kept referring to the baby as a baby. And the reporter at one point stopped him and said, you know, I have to stop you. You keep calling the fetus a baby. Do you really think that it's a baby? And he said, oh, I know it's a baby. And she said, well, don't you have an issue with that you're killing, if that's what you believe, that you're killing babies inside the womb? And he said, as long as it's in the woman's uterus, it doesn't bother me at all. So that's where we're at. You know, and as I said, my sister is a NICU nurse, and she and I have had conversations about the doctors and nurses that work in her unit, and they're pretty apologetic of, you know, what they would say terminating the pregnancy. Some of them, she's heard comments over the years that if a baby is suffering in a particular way, the doctor or the nurse will say, you know, I wish that the parents had terminated when they had the chance. And her way of explaining it is that it's their job to know that it's a baby, so they know it's a baby when it's in the womb, when it's, you know, 21 weeks, 20 weeks, 19 weeks, they know it's a baby. And that's kind of where we're at now, is that, you know, Ralph Northam is the governor of Virginia who said that if a baby was born during a botched abortion, the doctor would make the baby comfortable and then he and the woman together would decide how to proceed. In other words, whether to, you know, provide that child with the care it needed or to essentially starve it to death. So that's really, I think, where we're at. We're in this place that people recognize that it is a baby and it's now a different conversation. So now what we have to convince people of is that this life is worth actually protecting, which I think from the Christian standpoint, we have a lot of foundation to stand on because we know where we come from. But that's a tough argument to make when you're talking, you know, in the secular context. So that's just my side comment, my thought about that. So this is a dilation and extraction, partial birth abortion after 20 weeks. And then the final procedure in the third trimester, 25 plus weeks, these are viable babies, is the induction abortion. This abortion procedure takes 3 or 4 days typically. On the first day, the doctor will inject a needle into the baby's heart that causes the baby to have a heart attack and die. So this is a key part here because we often hear this argument that, well, it's my body, my choice. This is a separate body that this chemical is affecting. This chemical is affecting the body of a separate human being with separate DNA and a separate heartbeat inside of this woman's womb. Separate body. So the first day, a needle is injected into the baby's heart that causes the baby's heart to stop. That same day, the abortionist will begin to dilate the mother's cervix using what are called laminaria sticks. And this is in order to deliver the dead baby a few days later. On the second day, the abortionist will continue to dilate the mother's cervix, and he'll also use an ultrasound machine to check and make sure that the baby is actually dead. So sometimes when the baby receives this injection, he or she doesn't actually die. So sometimes they have to administer a second injection to make sure that the baby actually passes. The abortionist also, as I said, he starts to dilate the mother's cervix further, and he'll also give her some labor-inducing medications. So he'll really begin to prepare her to go into labor because she has to labor a dead baby, essentially. At this point, on the third or fourth day, the woman will deliver the dead baby either in the clinic or at home by herself. There is an organization in Chicago called the Chicago Abortion Fund, and it is their mission to, you know, what they would say, help women from other states travel to Chicago to receive abortions if they need them, and their home state, it's not accessible for them if they live in, you know, a very pro-life state. So they bring these women in from other states. They set them up with transportation, with funding, with a place to stay we recently discovered that there is a hotel in the Loop that provides discounted room rates to women who come into the city and prove that they have made an appointment for an abortion. So you have women who will have a discounted roommate to stay in a hotel for a few days to have her abortion procedure done. And that's an example of how deep it goes in Chicago. That we're working on a list right now, actually, to determine what hotels are participating in this, so people know not to use them. But how we figured it out is that one of the girls who works at the Women's Center up in Chicago, she was on an abortion clinic's website, and she realized that if you make an appointment for an abortion procedure using their online form, it redirects you to the hotel's website, and you have an automatic discount pinned to your page there. So this is an induction procedure. This is a 3 to 4 day procedure, and again, this is after 25 weeks. Any questions about any of this that I can answer for you before we move forward?
Can I make a comment, though?
Yeah.
When you look at the procedures that are happening, 10 years ago, DNX and induction were almost unfathomable. You just didn't hear about them, didn't know about them, didn't perform them. And just 30 years prior, the other two were also. At this rate where Illinois is going, what's gonna happen in 10 more years, where the baby is born, and then now it's 1-year-old or 2-year-old, and they decide it's not worthy of keeping. So we think what's ludicrous today might not be ludicrous in 5 or 10 more years.
Well, and I think to your point too, we often hear people say, "Oh, that's crazy, that will never happen," and then we use it as an excuse not to get involved. And look where we are. Nobody got involved because nobody believed that it was actually going to happen, and now this is where we're at. So,
I have a question. So the
Sure.
induction then is legal for anyone? There doesn't have to be a medical reason, they can just go?
yeah. So, yep. So the law that passed in the spring, the Reproductive Health Care Act, changed the way that this is allowed technically. So technically, it's not elective, which when we would consider an abortion that a woman just goes in and says, "I want an abortion," to be elective. It's technically not elective based on the law, but in practice, it's virtually elective. And the reason for that is that they have now redefined health of the patient to be financial health, relational health, all of these other areas are now considered a health reason for the woman to abort. So as long as she can provide one of those reasons. And it's interesting too, because the Guttmacher Institute is a research institute that Planned Parenthood and some of these other pro-abortion organizations use. And the Guttmacher Institute categorizes late-term third trimester abortion into, I believe, 5 different categories. And only 2% of third trimester abortions are performed authentically because there was a health issue for the mother. And we'll get into that again. There's really never a medical reason to abort a child. I mean, abortion, like we said, this takes 3 to 4 days. You can do an emergency C-section in 5 minutes. So it just doesn't make sense that they would even make that argument. But all of the other categories are things like, relationship problems. She just broke up with her boyfriend, or her parents are upset with her, or finances, she lost her job, or she's not sure how she's going to pay for this baby, or school, she's afraid that she can't finish school, things like that. So those are typically the reasons.
Okay.
Excuse
so
me,
we
do
want-
they, I've had surgery before, they go through the process of telling me what's gonna happen. These procedures, are they told what's gonna happen? Maybe they don't care, but are they?
No, so I have not heard of an experience that a woman's had where she's been told in the abortion clinic what will happen in the procedure. I don't believe that they usually are told, to be honest. I think that the conversation they have with the doctor in general is very minimal. I don't think they're told. A lot of the women's pregnancy centers that a lot of women find themselves in, some of the pregnancy centers in the state sort of advertise themselves as, like Waterleaf, for example, they advertise as, well, they do abortion screenings. And really what that is, for our purposes, is an opportunity to share with women what will actually happen during their abortion. And at that point, they learn those details. But that's something that they only get at a facility like a pregnancy resource center, where they're more concerned with actually convincing the woman that there is a better option, as opposed to selling her the abortion while she's there. So does that make sense?
I guess.
Yeah. Next we'll go through some common arguments that we hear, and there are a lot more. At this point, I usually take a moment just to acknowledge that we have books that some of you may have seen on the table in the back, and we also have these books in the pro-life toolkits that are available today as well. Yeah, and the books, so Steve, our program director, wrote this book himself. It's got pretty much everything you would need to know on this issue, I think, if you're looking to make a difference in your immediate network, in your immediate community. There's a lot of in-depth essays in here, but there's also really basic step-by-step information. So the arguments that we'll talk about today are pretty basic. The responses that we'll give you, again, are pretty simple, pretty basic. There's a lot more, I think, that you could say in response to some of these things. These are just some preliminary suggestions, but if you're interested in more resources in general, not only the resource as this book, but also this book has lists of resources in it, additional books, additional websites, things like that. You're welcome to take a book. They're totally free. We accept free will donations just to help us pay for the materials, but they are free for the taking if you'd like one. So the first argument that we address today that we often hear is, it's my body, my choice, a fetus is just a clump of cells. At the very moment of conception, a second body has begun to develop inside of the woman. So this body has totally separate DNA. If they did a DNA test, at that moment, the DNA would be totally separate from the mother's DNA, never repeated in the history of the world. After fertilization, the embryo instantly begins to grow. At only 1 week old, this new human being's brain, spinal cord, heart, and stomach tract are all already beginning to develop. And at 4 weeks old, which many women don't even know they're pregnant at 4 weeks old, the embryo has her own heartbeat. So there's 2 heartbeats from 4 weeks. That's really early. The baby does not look like a baby at 4 weeks. So the fact that there's a heartbeat there, that's a really good, that's an important tool that a lot of these pregnancy resource centers use when they talk to women and the women are receiving an ultrasound and they're talking to them about the humanity of their baby. Heartbeat's a really, really positive and important indicator for us in those instances. So it's my body, my choice. A fetus is just a clump of cells. It is not the woman's body. This baby has separate DNA, separate heartbeat at 4 weeks. 4 weeks is so early. Also has, its own brain, spinal cord, heart, and stomach tract that all begin developing within that first week of development. The second argument that we hear is, if you don't like abortion, don't get one. This logic is totally inconsistent with the logic that we use for all other laws that we have in our country. So, for example, if we said things like, if you don't like slavery, don't own slaves, or if you don't like rape, don't rape anyone, people would look at us like we were crazy. So this logic is just totally inconsistent with the logic that we use for laws. And one of the arguments that we make is that laws set the moral standard for society. So when we hear people say, well, let's just address the demand for abortion, and if we just make it so that women don't feel like they need one or they stop wanting one, we won't even have to make it illegal. Well, abortion, the culture is informed by laws. It's just the reality of the situation. And we've seen this with the strong, the rate of abortion has only gone up since Roe v. Wade was ruled on, and we were told that it would go down because abortion would be safe and accessible and women would have all of their options, and we were told that it would be less so, but it has been a straight line up from the very beginning. So we know that laws make people feel like things are wrong or things are okay. And in this case, Roe v. Wade has really made people feel in this culture like abortion is acceptable and it's fathomable, and it's something that not only should a woman have access to, she also actually needs it in some cases. So if you don't like an abortion, don't get one. This logic doesn't hold up. It's like saying if you don't like rape, don't rape anyone. And laws set the moral standard for society. That's really the key here. The third argument is men shouldn't have a say in abortion. It's a women's issue. Men are half of the equation when it comes to conceiving a child. We all know this, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. It's the reality. We have to have men in order to make babies. Additionally, men are also roughly half of the babies that are being aborted. So if you consider sex-selective abortions, which usually lean in the direction of affecting women, female babies more than male babies, we still have a large portion of abortions are being performed on male babies. If women's rights begin in the womb, men's rights also begin in the womb. So that's the key here. Men shouldn't have a say in abortion. It's a women's issue. That is not true. A mother is a mother at the moment of conception. A father is a father at the moment of conception. Additionally, roughly half of the babies that are aborted are male babies. we have in the toolkits in the back some of the other resources that we've included in there for you if you're interested in them. We have some pamphlets, an array of pamphlets, but one of the pamphlets that we have in there for you is how men are affected by abortion. It provides information on that. We have men who reach out to our organization all the time because they're coming to terms with an abortion that they either pushed a girlfriend into, or they're still mourning the loss of a child that they wanted to keep and that their wife or girlfriend didn't want to keep. Even in the case of siblings or situations that the man might not have even known. I recently met a girl at one of these events who told me that when she was very, very, very young, she had overheard her mother talking about an abortion that her mother had had a few years prior to her birth. So her older sibling, her mother aborted her older sibling. And she said that she carried this with her well into her 20s. She has struggled with self-hatred and depression and anxiety. She's told me that she struggles to leave her home, and that she was able to, she's finally begun to heal from this, just the simple knowledge that her mother had had an abortion, because this past summer her father died, and it opened up a conversation that her mother actually admitted to her that, yes, I aborted your older sibling before you were conceived. And just that conversation alone has really begun to open the floodgates for her, that she's starting to heal, and there are conversations happening. And I think that's a really good example of how someone who wasn't even living when this abortion occurred was still affected by it. Her relationships were affected by it. Her feelings about herself were affected by it. And that's something that we look at with the men as well, that men are affected by this just as much as women are. So those are the first three. It's my body, my choice. A fetus is just a clump of cells. If you don't like abortion, don't get one. Men shouldn't have a say in abortion. It's a women's issue. The next is Planned Parenthood is a women's health organization. Planned Parenthood is a women's health organization. Planned Parenthood is the largest abortion provider in the United States, performing roughly 323,000 abortions annually across the country. And while they claim to be a women's healthcare provider, there are many, many crucial women's healthcare services that they don't actually provide. They don't provide mammograms. If you're pregnant and you're looking for prenatal care, they don't provide any of that for you. If you are trying to get pregnant, they can't help you with that. So it's really, unless you want to get rid of your baby or you don't want to get pregnant, those are really the things that they can help you with as a woman. Other than that, they obviously do STD testing and some of these other things, but they are not concerned with helping couples start their families, helping couples sustain their families, their healthy pregnancies. They're not in the business of those things. So they don't provide crucial women's healthcare services that are actually necessary for women's health. In addition, another argument that we include here and that we like to add is one would imagine that an organization that is concerned with women's healthcare would be simultaneously concerned with protecting vulnerable women. Planned Parenthood has been the subject of more than 13 lawsuits which claimed that the so-called women's healthcare provider failed to report cases of sexual abuse and trafficking to the appropriate authorities. So this happened in states such as Alabama, Arizona, Ohio, Colorado, California, Connecticut, and Minnesota. And then Live Action, which is Lila Rose's organization, they have further video evidence that shows that this same type of practices and behavior of failing to report cases of trafficking and abuse have also occurred in Indiana, Tennessee, and Wisconsin. So we know that this happens. It's not an isolated issue. This is an issue that happens in Planned Parenthood clinics across the country. There was a video in 2011 that Live Action did where they sent in two actors, a man and a woman, who posed as a pimp and a prostitute. They sent them into an abortion clinic in California, and these two sat down and had a meeting with the clinic manager. It's all on video. You can see the woman's face through the entire meeting. And over the course of this meeting, it came out from these two actors, this pimp and this prostitute, that they were running a sex working ring, a prostitution ring, and that they were looking for birth control and abortions for their underage, non-English speaking, undocumented sex workers. So they're slaves from my perspective, because these women are children, essentially. They don't speak the language. They don't have documentation to be here legally. And they were working for them as sex workers. And this clinic manager, instead of asking more questions and alerting the authorities, she proceeded to walk them through the form and actually show them how to fill out the form in such a way that they would get the birth control and the abortions that they needed without raising any red flags or causing any follow-up of any kind or any questions to be asked, so that they can continue to do this work without alerting the authorities. So it's very clear when we see instances like that, and this was a very clear one. Of course, Planned Parenthood used this woman as a scapegoat, and they fired her and said this will never happen again, and yada yada yada, and all these things. But this list of states, I think, tells us everything we need to know that this is happening across the country. So it's very clear that their priority is selling abortions and is not actually protecting vulnerable women and girls. So that's the fourth. If you Planned Parenthood is a women's healthcare organization. And then the fifth argument that we hear often, and this is probably the biggest one I would say right now, is abortion should be allowed in cases of rape, incest, or to save the life of the mother. First and foremost, I think it's important to note that cases of rape, incest, and to save the life of the mother are less than, I think, roughly 2 or 3% of all abortions. So the vast majority of abortions are elective abortions. They're abortions that occur simply because the woman does not want to keep the child. So first, in the case of rape or incest, the circumstances of a pregnancy, however tragic they may be, do not justify the willful termination of a human life. Specifically, we talk about the rape example. There are consequences for people who are convicted of rape in every state, but we never give them the death penalty. Why would we give the death penalty to the child for something that its biological father did? And I think this question is an example of a way that we can reframe some of these questions to actually turn these issues on their heads and make people really think about what it is that they're defending when we talk about this rape exception. Another example is, to save the life of the mother. Abortion is never medically necessary to save the life of the mother. Dr. Anthony Levatino is a former abortionist who now works with Live Action. He's made videos with them. He talks about the abortion procedures. He's performed over 1,200 abortions in his career. And for about 9 years, he worked in a women's medical center where he saved hundreds of women's lives by prematurely inducing labor as opposed to aborting. So he said that even when he was an abortionist, he never had to abort a baby to save the mother's life. And again, this goes back to, some of these procedures take a lot of time. There's a lot of bleeding involved. They're dangerous all on their own. Whereas a C-section takes 5 minutes, in and out. That's it. It's quick. That's the real emergency, the real way to handle an emergency situation. And specifically the health example that we hear that feels like a real predicament, and it is a bit of an ethical issue, but there is a solution, is an ectopic pregnancy. So an ectopic pregnancy is when the embryo embeds itself in the fallopian tube. So the fallopian tube is not a conducive environment to carry a pregnancy to full term. It simply can't. The baby won't receive the nutrients, won't receive any of what it needs to grow and develop to full term. And unfortunately, there just isn't technology at this point to make a transfer, to safely make a transfer from the fallopian tube to the uterus for the baby. So at this point, this is also threatening for the mother's life. So at this point, what we suggest, and what there is a procedure that what actually happens is they remove the portion of the fallopian tube where the embryo has embedded itself, and they cut it away, take it out of the woman's body. And at this point, the embryo will die on its own. It will die naturally as a result of the same lack of nutrients and blood supply that it would have lacked anyway. But in this case, we're able to save the mother's life. So at this point, they're also able to save her organs so that she can go on to carry healthy pregnancies. So, and this is just an incredibly unfortunate ethical dilemma, but it's one that we go back to. We are not willfully killing the child in the womb. We're not willfully taking that child's life, and that's the key here, really. So the fifth was abortion should be allowed in cases of rape, incest, or to save the life of the mother. So at this point, what we'll do, at this point is I will explain a little bit of the way that we perceive the national context and how it affects Illinois and how Illinois is being used in the national context as sort of it's being leveraged for the sake of protecting the bottom line of all of these abortion clinics that are losing ground in other states. And then we can just take some time for questions or discussion, whatever you all feel you'd like to hear from us, and I'm sure Ralph would be happy to answer some questions too at that point. So, back in July, last July 2018, Justice Kavanaugh was appointed to the Supreme Court, and that fall we saw this painful approval process in the Senate that they have since pretty well admitted was really all about protecting Roe v. Wade. They're most concerned with protecting Roe v. Wade. We found out yesterday that August of 2018, so 1 month after Justice Kavanaugh was appointed to the Supreme Court, they broke ground on the Planned Parenthood that they've been secretly building for the last year and a half here in Illinois. And in the spring of 2019, so last spring, in February of 2019, end of winter, early spring, they introduced the Reproductive Health Care Act to the House and the Senate, to the state legislature. And the Reproductive Health Care Act was unpopular with pro-life people from the very beginning. We had a historic turnout. I'm sure some of you may have seen emails at some point from our organization or others about filing witness slips and coming down to our rally on March 20th that we had down in Springfield. We had total about 20,000 witness slips filed in opposition to this bill over the course of the few months that it was in play down in Springfield. We had upwards of 4,000 people show up at our rally on March 20th down in Springfield. That was historic by its own right. They had to close down they had to actually shut the doors of the Capitol building because the building itself was at max capacity. So people showed up in droves, and legislators heard us. It is clear that legislators heard us. We didn't hear anything. There was some back and forth with the bill. It didn't make its way out of committee. Fran Hurley was the chairperson of the committee that this bill was in prior to seeing the floor, and she said on the record at one point that she was not going to touch it. She wasn't going to move it unless she was told otherwise. So it sat in committee for a few weeks. We had our rally. We didn't hear much about it after that for a few weeks. We thought maybe it was dead, maybe they would bring it up the last week of the session. And then in late April, Georgia and Alabama and some of these other very pro-life states around the country passed their extremely pro-life laws. And around this time, the conversation about the RHA started to come up again. And I personally believe that at this point, they were getting a little bit of national pressure because Illinois was going to be the state that would leverage all of the other states. Planned Parenthood promised publicly in the fall when the Kavanaugh proceedings were happening that they were going to leverage states like Illinois, Virginia, and New York to protect the losses that they would inevitably face in other states, and also to protect access to abortion if Roe v. Wade were overturned. So Illinois, prior to the spring, Illinois is what's called a trigger state. So essentially what that means is that if a federal ruling occurs that changes the way states can rule on can legislate a certain issue, in the event that that federal ruling is ever overturned, the state law immediately goes back to what it was prior to the federal ruling. So in the case of Roe v. Wade, Illinois had a law on the books that criminalized abortion. When Roe v. Wade was ruled on, that law was no longer in effect. So we still had it on the books until the spring. That law was no longer in effect. If Roe v. Wade were overturned, if it's overturned in the next 5 years, prior to this spring, because of our trigger law, it would have immediately become a crime in the state of Illinois to perform an abortion. All of the abortion organizations across the country know this. I'm sure that they looked at a map and they said, okay, which states are trigger states, and which of the trigger states do we have the greatest chance of getting rid of these laws, getting these laws off the books before it happens, so that we can continue to dig our claws deeper and deeper and expand the opportunity for abortion as wide as we possibly can get it. So that's what they've done here in Illinois. So in May, they started to talk about the RHA again. We started hearing about it again. The Democratic caucus met. Kelly Cassidy is one of the legislators who introduced this legislation. She came out of their Democratic caucus meeting just before Memorial Day weekend and said on the record that Mike Madigan promised that he was going to find another avenue with which to pass this legislation. So Memorial Day weekend, that Sunday evening, we were waiting for it. I'm sure some of you were waiting just like we were for an email from us that would tell you what to do in terms of witness slips and phone calls and these other things. Sunday evening of Memorial Day weekend, they gave us 45 minutes in committee. They scheduled a hearing, they gave us 45 minutes, and they brought up a Senate bill that they did what's called a gut and replace. So this Senate bill was a mental health bill, totally unrelated to abortion, and they totally gutted it once it passed through the Senate. They took everything out and they put into it the RHA. So they cut and pasted in the RHA. And then they gave us 45 minutes, they scheduled a hearing, said, okay, in 45 minutes we're going to have this hearing, then we'll hold a vote. And they held the vote. We had very little time to file witness slips. I think we were still able to file 4 or 5,000 witness slips at this time, so people were still paying attention, even though it was, you know, a Sunday evening over Memorial Day weekend. They shoved it through committee, and then by Tuesday it was on the House floor. It passed the House floor, and then the Senate voted it in, I think that Friday around midnight. So they pushed it through. It was the down to the wire, the very, very last week of session they pushed this through, and then Governor Pritzker signed it in June. So I'll go through a little bit some of what's in the bill, and we can talk about that, and then at that point we'll take some time for questions. And feel free to, you know, if you have a clarifying question at this point or anything like that, we have time. You can just stop me and we can talk more directly, and I'm sure Ralph probably has some insights that I don't necessarily have, so we can have him answer some of those questions too.
Mary Kay, I don't know if you're going to address it at this session, but how is that even legal?
Yeah.
Like, how could they even do that to this?
Yeah.
That drives me nuts.
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to that.
No, it's
I would hope that
legal.
someone
The
can
House
address it.
rules allows for, so for example, a Senate bill goes to the House. And.
Can you come up here, Ralph?
Oh, okay. I don't want to take the
Oh.
time.
Yeah, no, it's good. This is great.
So what they did is not fun, but it's allowed by rule. A Senate bill moves to the House, passes the Senate, moves to the House. They may feel they don't need that bill, they're gonna let it, now lots of bills die. They move and then they don't go anywhere. So to speed up time, to take a new bill, it has to go through the House on 3 separate days and read 3 times. Then go over to the Senate and be read 3 separate times on 3 days for the Senate. So when you only got a week left, you're running out of time. So what they normally do is take a bill on the other side, a Senate bill in the House or House bill in the Senate, and they gut and replace, that bill's dead. Whatever the content was, they put in this new language, and now the House just has to vote on it. You send it back to the Senate, and it could be the same day. It's called a concurrence. Do you concur with the amendment that the House put on the Senate bill? And that's done all the time. But they played it just, you know, it was a Sunday evening before Memorial Day. How many people are watching? How many? And yet, when I told Mary Kate and our people that this was the bill number, this is what they were going to, I was amazed at how many thousands
amazing.
were
Yeah.
still listening. It just shows you how many people are sitting around the internet on Sunday night. And so they did that. And so I was able to testify. One of the members of the Catholic Conference was able to testify. But that was it. I mean, it was like, I walked in and they said, hey, Ralph, the bill is this, it's coming up. And so we couldn't get our doctors, our lawyers to come and present. So, but it was we knew it was getting out of that committee. But we just had an opportunity to talk like that a little bit. So, what they're doing is legal. It's just, you know, it's
So
such
how
a
does it go from-
controversial bill.
How does it go from being a bill to an addendum, though?
It's an amendment.
Or an amendment?
Oh,
It's
amendments
so-
are done all the time. You
Well, then
can.
why bother putting a bill forward?
Well, no, it's part of, technically, it's part of deliberation and debate and so forth. So you take a Senate bill, goes to the House, they don't have to accept everything the Senate did. The House can say, well, you know what, we'd like to tweak it here. I'm talking not about an abortion bill, but any bill. And so they add an amendment in the House. They say, this we think will make the bill better and that we feel comfortable doing. Then they send it back to the Senate and say, would you concur with this? The Senate can say, no, take it off. And so there's that type of thing. So it's not a bad thing, it's a part of the process. But the way you do it, you know, just, you don't do it and then all of a sudden the last week, Sunday night, they're hoping nobody's listening. That's bad. This is so controversial, Bill, why you'd want to do this. Why don't you be upfront and take your votes that way? So.
The gut,
Until
because,
I'm
right,
not.
because if you're gutting the whole thing, then
Right.
it should be the 3 days.
It's a bit devious, that's why.
Yeah, I think devious is the right word.
So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for.
Yeah, yeah, of course. So the first two primary things that this bill does is it creates a fundamental right to abortion, and it provides that a fetus does not have a right to life. So what it says, I believe, is an individual, not a woman, an individual, because it's not just women who apparently need abortions nowadays, an individual has a right to an abortion. And what this line does is it provides for the law what Roe v. Wade would provide for the law. So it provides for the law in the event that Roe v. Wade is overturned. We now have a line in the law that says, no, a woman has a fundamental right to an abortion. And fundamental right is a powerful phrase when we're talking about law in the United States of America, because a fundamental right, I mean, you can't mess with that. So that's a scary, pair of words all on their own when we're talking about abortion. So it creates a fundamental right to abortion, and it also says that a fetus does not have a right to life. It redefines fetal viability and health of the patient. So we talked earlier about the third trimester change, that now health of the patient can mean social, financial, some of these other things. It can really mean anything. Effectively it's an elective abortion, although that's not the term that they use. In terms of fetal viability, there was a debate. One of the more difficult issues, I think one of the issues that they struggled to convince legislators to vote for the most, was no physician has to be present in the room to perform an abortion. I think maybe Ralph would agree with me that a lot of the legislators were unconvinced that that was A, necessary, and B, even a good idea. So they compromised here, and they said, okay, what we'll do is we'll redefine fetal viability, and then we'll say that a physician only has to be present after the fetus is viable, after the baby's viable. So they've now redefined fetal viability as 26 weeks, or when the people in the room think that baby would not need extraordinary measures of care. And that's and it's funny. I mean, so I presented this at Waterleaf, and Michelle has heard all of this, but I appreciate that you're having the same responses all over again, because it's like shocking the second time around too, isn't it? Yeah. So basically, a bunch of legislators decided when a baby will or will not live outside the womb, is pretty much what happened here. I told you, I shared with you all that my sister has had the youngest babies that she's had in the NICU are 22, 23 weeks. So this is a 26-week baby that's considered viable. In terms of extraordinary measures of care, that's a very vague statement. We don't necessarily have a strong definition of what that means. Extraordinary measure of care could be ventilator, incubator. Any premature baby is going to need an incubator and a ventilator right off the bat. So it's easy for them to circumvent this viability idea by simply saying, well, this baby would need an extraordinary measure of care, even though it is 26 weeks, approaching 27 weeks. So we're just going to go ahead and make the choice to proceed. So, and we'll see with a lot of what's in this law that it's intentionally vague for that reason, that it leaves a lot of room, not only for interpretation when it comes to the clinics and the abortionists and the people who work in the clinics, but it also leaves a lot of interpretation from a legal perspective for, if a lawsuit is ever brought up that a clinic or an abortionist is being is charged with something or accused of something, they have a lot more wiggle room to argue that they were within the law, because the law is very, very vague. So this additionally jeopardizes the enforcement of the Parental Notification of Abortion Act. So parental notification, they tried to repeal parental notification in the spring along with passing the RHA. They were not able to push it through. There, I believe, are some legislators down in Springfield who are pro-choice, but as adults with teenage daughters, they don't feel comfortable saying that they would be okay with their daughter receiving an abortion and not being notified about it. For this, just to be clear, there's two separate laws when we're talking about parental notification or parental consent. So it's either a parental notification law, which requires that an abortion clinic notify a minor girl's parent 48 hours prior to her receiving the abortion, which is what we have in Illinois, or there's a consent law that says that her parents have to actually consent to that procedure. So in Illinois, a parent does not have to consent for their minor daughter to receive an abortion. They do have to be notified 48 hours prior, and legislators in Springfield want to repeal this law. They want to get rid of it. So they tried to repeal it in the spring. They were unsuccessful. We've heard that they may bring it up in the veto session, although I heard again recently that maybe that won't happen, but we'll see, we don't know. And in terms of this law in particular, there is another way that they could get rid of parental notification in the event that they don't do it through through legislation. And what they'll do is they'll bring up a case in light of this new law that says that they say in the case that, well, this minor girl wanted to receive an abortion, her parents were notified, it placed an undue burden on her fundamental right, which the law now says she has a fundamental right to abortion, and then there's potential for this law to be overturned or to be, null as a result of litigation, as a result of an actual court case. So we think that they may try to take that approach if they are unsuccessful at just repealing the law outright. So this law potentially allows for that to occur. It allows for them to repeal this parental notification law. A couple of comments about the parental notification law. A key item here that I point out to people is that Chicago is a human trafficking hub nationally. So, and that 5580 intersection, we have a lot of national traffic right there just south of the city. And in Chicago, we know that human trafficking is a major issue. We also know that roughly a third of victims of human trafficking eventually at some point over the time that they're being trafficked find themselves in an abortion clinic. So we know that this is an opportunity for, it's like what we would call a checkpoint. It's an opportunity for us to intervene and to enter into that victim trafficking relationship. But we have to first have the opportunity. The repeal of parental notification will deny us that opportunity. Parental notification is one of those ways that we require that a legal guardian or a parent be notified, and it allows someone to step in. We know in 2017 that the youngest girl to receive an abortion in Illinois and have it paid for with taxpayer funding was 12 years old. So any responsible adult can look at that situation and know something is not right here and someone needs to intervene. And without this law, her abuser or her trafficker could simply walk her into a clinic and she could receive an abortion and no one would ever know that it happened. So we need this law on the books. We need it on the books. Not just for these girls who are being abused, but also for trafficking victims. So that's key, and that's my comment about that. Chicago is a human trafficking hub. We know that. This law is more important here than it is anywhere else.
Can you explain how how does that prevent, or how does parent notification allow someone else to step in?
Yeah, so I think the idea here is that if a parent is notified that a minor girl goes into the clinic and was seeking an abortion, it allows them, they become privy to the situation. Abortion, it's
It's a human trafficking situation.
That
The
never gets
parent-
asked.
Right, but
Well, they have to find out what the parents' names are.
right. I
They
think
need to
if you're being
report it to
accused
DCFS.
right. It prompts some
And
questions.
it's supposed to roll, like they gotta really.
Totally, yeah. It takes time.
Right, this way they usher it in very quickly.
Right, and it's over. Yeah. I think the key is that it just allows some intervention. So there are some additional questions that are asked.
Probably privately too, like they're not gonna have whoever's with her in there in the room.
Right. I think so. Yeah.
That's time,
Exactly.
right?
Yep.
That's huge.
Time and just additional questions and conversation. Yeah. It's just an opportunity for us to ask more questions.
If they
Well,
can't provide the parent's name and address.
right. There's an issue here. Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Well, and again, but all of this being said, we recognize that who are we tasking with this responsibility of doing all of this? The same who benefit from allowing this girl to just receive an abortion. Yeah, exactly. Who make money off of it? So that's the other issue. We hope that this girl will encounter someone who is personally convicted to protect victims. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. So sure.
I heard you said something that she got the abortion based off of taxpayer money. How does that happen?
So in Illinois, in 2017, Governor Rauner signed House Bill 40. And House Bill 40 was a very short act that said that women in the state of Illinois can receive an abortion and have it paid for through Medicaid with taxpayer funding. So if you're in the state and the process for checking, there are certain there are certain qualifying factors in order for a woman to be eligible for Medicaid. The process to actually check that is virtually non-existent. So we know that there are likely women who are coming in from other states and providing, weak evidence that says that, well, they're either a state resident or, what have you, that they're a resident and that they're also have an income level that provides that they're eligible for Medicaid, and then at that point, they're able to.
They don't have to be residents anymore now, do they?
They have to say they're a resident.
Right.
Yeah. So, and that's really the process, I think, is they ask you, are you a resident, right? Yeah.
There's a federal program called Medicaid Presumptively Eligible. And it says if any woman's pregnant, citizen, non-citizen, whatever age, whatever, you can be, can be determined to whether you can get Medicaid. It's a temporary amount, like 90 days, and then you have to go through more information. But if you read the All Kids, Moms and Babies manual, and I have that, and I can get that for you, anybody interested, it says, ask the woman what your income is. Interesting, the feds recognize the unborn child as a person. So if it's a woman who's pregnant, it's 2 members in the family. And so what's the income level for 2 people? And then, so at least that, you could have 3 or 4, but at least 2 people, that's recognized. So the other thing you ask is, ask them, and on the income level, they say, well, I'm not working, or I only make $100 a month. Don't verify it at that level, because you're gonna do it for just 90 days. If you want it for longer, now you're gonna have to show a paycheck, or you're gonna have to show something. But for that first month or 2, you don't have to show anything. They also ask, this is part of the manual, ask them, are you or are you not a resident of the state of Illinois? And then it says, don't ask for verification. So this mega abortion clinic that's being set up in Missouri, they cross state lines. They say, are you a resident of the state of Illinois? They say, yes. They don't ask for any verification, especially if you're the abortion clinic, you're doing. So I kind of went ahead of myself. There's a proposed rule by the Healthcare and Family Services that Illinois Right to Life Action is fighting, because this proposed rule will expand those who can determine if the pregnant woman is eligible. And one of those groups that can make that determination, if this rule goes forward, is Planned Parenthood abortion clinics. Well, you have the woman come over from Missouri, you're sitting in the Planned Parenthood abortion facility, they say, are you a resident? Yes. And they give them the Medicaid card, our tax dollar medical card, and they get the abortion, they go into Missouri, and that's it. So, to your question, so our taxpayer dollars will pay for those abortions, and even legitimate, if they're a resident here, if they're under a certain economic level, they can get Medicaid, and the state will pay for it. The feds will only pay for life, rape, and incest. And so the feds will, under Medicaid, will pay for no abortions that don't fit that category. And like 99% of them, don't fit, or let's say 97 don't fit that category. So the state of Illinois pays 100% of that, nothing on the federal.
Is there an age limit
No age.
to insurance?
No.
Now, what if the girl already has insurance through her parents? And then they get to open that bill and say, oh.
They won't, so that's so
They won't
funny.
ask.
So.
No, that's how parents are gonna start finding out.
Yes, so there's a lot of questions about that, because I don't know, I'm not sure how the insurance company will be advised to handle that, but I was told by someone who was at one of these events that she worked for an insurance company, that she had to deliver some of those difficult phone calls, that she had to explain to someone who called and said, what's this procedure that I paid for on my family's plan? And actually, the insurance company, if it's something like this, that it's, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Again, it's vague, we don't know, because under HIPAA, parents have access to that information for their minor children. But the law in Illinois would suggest that if it's an abortion-specific procedure, that parents do not have a right necessarily to that information unless parental notification would require they have to be notified. But if that is repealed, they won't have a right to that information. So this person I talked to said that the insurance company will not provide that. It'll be redacted. So they'll be able to see maybe like what the facility was, but they won't have access to what the procedure actually is. And they can call the insurance company, and the insurance company won't provide them the information.
Well,
That's
that
what
should be
this.
a great indicator
I
of
know.
What's going on, exactly, exactly.
It's the one thing you can't
Yeah,
find out about.
exactly.
Right.
Well, I mean, that's the other funny thing, that's where a lot of these laws that we hear about sometimes, like I recently heard one of the legislators in Springfield made some comment about a law that, actually, no, that's not true. So personal PAC, Political Action Committee, they're the abortion PAC that, works with all these Democratic pro-choice candidates in Illinois, and they set them up with consultants, and they, help them campaign and endorse them and all of these things. Terry Cosgrove has been doing this almost as long as Mike Madigan. Terry Cosgrove is the president and CEO of Personal PAC. He sent out an email a couple of weeks ago talking about how the pro-lifers in the state want to go back to the day that there were laws that required that a wife receive permission from her husband before she could have an abortion. But that's another example of what we're talking about with the insurance issue. That again, if a wife is using her husband's insurance plan and she receives an abortion, because this law now requires that private insurance cover abortions. And there's no exemption for religious organizations, churches, nothing at all. If a wife uses that plan, receives an abortion, her husband sees that statement, he has no rights to that information at all, to know or be told by the insurance company that she received that. So again, all of it will be ruled by litigation, because ultimately it will be determined how these things are actually enforced when the case is brought up, and that's what they want. It's intentionally vague. They want as much opportunity to perform abortions and have women pay for abortions in the state as they possibly can. So that's why they've pushed it all the way to the due date. And then in addition to that, now they push for things like RU486 in vending machines, because they want to get them as early as possible, because if they can get them before it looks like a baby, the likelihood that they'll abort is higher. And then once it starts to look like a baby and they can look at an ultrasound and see that that's a baby inside there, then there's a greater chance that they'll be able to convince that, pregnancy resource centers and some others will be able to convince them that that actually is a baby. But in those first 10 weeks, that's when they really want to get them. So the combination of pushing RU486 really early, and then also opening up that opportunity in the third trimester when women are feeling like, this is real, I could go into labor any day, then they're opening it up to catch them there too. And minor girls as well. Now they're preying on minor girls. So this law additionally effectively eliminates licensing and health and safety inspections of abortion clinics in the state. So prior to this law passing, there was very few, it's very confusing when you get into it, the different categories of licenses and inspection requirements and all of these other things. Not a single Planned Parenthood in the state has been licensed or inspected by the Department of Public Health since 1999. So I think that tells us what we need to know about whether or not these laws are consistent with what is actually going on inside these clinics. We have a report on our website that you can view, if you go to womenshealthcomesfirst.com. We did a FOIA request back in 2014 of every abortion clinic in the state, and the last time it had been inspected, and whether or not it was licensed, and what the results of the inspections were, if it had ever been inspected at any point. Numerous clinics that are listed on there were closed after they were inspected because the results were so bad. If any of you have seen the movie Gosnell, some of this stuff is totally real and happening in abortion clinics in Illinois. So some of these clinics were closed. A lot of them, we actually detailed the results of a lot of these inspections on the website, so you can see them. It's womenshealthcomesfirst.com. In addition to that, where was I going with that? I just lost my train of thought.
Inspected.
Yeah. So not licensed or inspected. This law actually changes the way that all of this was categorized. So prior to the spring, there were some clinics that were licensed and inspected. Now, Essentially, if you are an abortion provider, you don't have to be licensed or inspected by the Department of Public Health at all. It's a separate license process, and there's no inspection requirement. Additionally, I remembered what I was going to say. So I said, in order to create this report, we FOIA requested Freedom of Information Act. We FOIA requested all of the records that the Department of Public Health and the Department of Finance had on abortion clinic licenses and prior inspections. Now, under this law, we cannot FOIA request anything pertaining to abortion at all. So we have no access, the public has no access to those records. So it's an issue not only because we can't keep tabs on the abortion clinics, we can't keep tabs on the state either. So we just have to trust that the state's actually reporting the information that they're getting, and that if things are going on, that they're actually telling the public, which they have an interest as well in avoiding that information. So it eliminates licensing and health and safety inspections of abortion clinics, forces private insurance companies to cover abortion, as we mentioned, no exception for churches, synagogues, mosques, or other religious institutions. It additionally, I mentioned this too, it allows non-physicians to do chemical and medical abortions like RU486 for the first time in Illinois, so doctors are not required to prescribe this medication. It can be administered by a nurse. It removes language with requirements for physicians if babies are born alive in abortion. So prior to the spring, to this law passing, physicians who were present in the room during an abortion that a baby was born alive, that physician was responsible for providing care to that baby. Now that no such requirement exists, they don't have to provide care. They can choose to just leave that baby left to die. And that's inevitably what will likely happen in a lot of these circumstances. This additionally removes the law prohibiting referral fees or kickbacks for abortion referrals. So if a doctor refers a woman to a particular clinic to receive an abortion, he can receive a kickback for that. And then additionally, the last point on here, although there is more that we didn't talk about here, it removes the requirement for county coroners to investigate a maternal or fetal death due to abortion. So if a woman dies in an abortion clinic, and again, this is vague, we talked about this at Waterloo when I was there, that the coroner doesn't necessarily operate based on the state law. County coroners are elected at the county level, and one could assume that their guidelines are probably given to them at the county level as well. So it's kind of confusing, this particular aspect of the law, because it removes the requirement for county coroners to investigate. I'm not sure that the coroner, that's not necessarily how a coroner operates. If the family requests that there be an investigation, how would the coroner choose to respond to that? And it's intentionally vague. The thought here that we have is that they wrote it this way: in the event that a woman does die in an abortion clinic and a coroner goes in, despite this law that says that they don't have to go in, the coroner goes in, does an investigation, finds that this clinic is guilty in some shape or form, that this clinic either contributed to her death or some sort of malpractice, something to that effect, there's potential in a court of law that an argument could be made that the coroner broke the law by going into the clinic to investigate, and that evidence could potentially be thrown out. So again, this is just an opportunity for them to protect clinics, protect abortionists, and it's pure crazy. It's absolutely crazy, yeah. So are there any questions? Did I miss anything, Ralph? Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I covered it.
Okay.
Was there anything?
Any questions?
Was there one positive thing out of all of this?
Is there one positive thing?
Was there?
I
missed it.
Let me say this. Most depressing presentation ever. I know, I'm so sorry. I know. Here's the positive thing from my perspective is, first of all, we have seen pro-life people turn out in the state like never before. And I believe, I say this everywhere I go, that Ralph told us when all this was going on, that in the 30 years, almost 30 years, not quite 30 years, right, that he's been doing this in Springfield. Close. That he's been doing this in Springfield. He has never seen turnout like this on any issue, not just the abortion issue. So I think that tells us a lot about how people in the state of Illinois feel about this issue. And I think there's some grace in the fact that this law brought all of those people, to the forefront. That I don't care what, it's a funny thing. Witness slips are a funny thing because all the legislators in Springfield say that they don't pay attention to the witness slips. It's really hard to not pay attention to witness slips when there are 20,000 of them on a single bill. So I think I mean, let's continue to file witness slips, that's my attitude, but
And please speak to the fact that how often they expire. Because we think, oh, I already did that one.
yeah, and you have to do it again every time that they, well, and that's funny. I have thought about that. So that when the bill was in committee, they schedule it for a hearing, and it's after they schedule the committee or the bill for a hearing that witness slips open and we have the opportunity to file witness slips. That first round of witness slips, I think we had like 7,000 or 8,000 filed, and they never called the bill to hearing on that scheduled day. And I personally believe that they did that because they knew that a legislator would request that all of those thousands of witness slips be added to the record, and that would be a problem that they could no longer ignore. So if they could avoid it by not ever calling it to a hearing, not ever providing legislators, pro-life legislators, with an opportunity to request that those be added to the record, exactly, then they, I don't know, is the term expire, Ralph, would you say? That they just expire and they don't count anymore, so we have to do it all over again. So yeah, I think there were four or five rounds of filing witness slips, and it's for that reason. So total we had, I think actually it was closer to 21,000 witness slips. Some of those, of course, I think were repeats, but nevertheless, the fact that we got people to do that 5 times says a lot. So, and in addition to that, so this tour that we're doing, for example, so many people showing up, connecting with us. It's the first time that they've been introduced to our organization, and on the flip side, it's the first time that we've been able to actually communicate with people face to face and explain what's in this bill, and also explain what what we're trying to do in the state. It's the beginnings of something. I also think, gosh, there is an abortion headline in the news every week, I feel like, nowadays. Just 2 weeks ago, it was Dr. Klopfer, the abortionist, who was operating in South Bend, Indiana, and was living here in Crete, Illinois. And he was actually practicing as an abortionist in Chicago for like 20 years before he started practicing in Indiana. And he, was I going with that? The fact, so he died on September 3rd. This is a side story about him, and I think it's a good story for all of us to remember that we need to continue to pray for the abortionists. If any of you heard of, so Pete Buttigieg was the mayor of South Bend when, he's the one running for president, that all of this conflict was happening with Dr. Klopfer's clinic. So Dr. Klopfer himself lost his license in 2016 because he administered an abortion on a 10-year-old girl without telling her parents. And he lost his license for that. And then in that following year, their clinic actually closed. A few years prior to all of that, Women's Care Center is a pregnancy center, a Christian pregnancy center, that they wanted to build a facility across the street from Dr. Klopfer's abortion clinic, and they actually wanted to build it next to it. And there were zoning laws that zoned them out of that area, that the city said you can't do it, but the city council decided, well, we'll rezone and we'll allow them to do it. Pete Buttigieg was mayor at the time, and he vetoed the vote that the city council voted. So the Women's Care Center said, okay, fine, we won't build next to it, we'll build across the street from it. So they built a facility across the street from the abortion clinic that Dr. Klopfer had been administering abortions in for years at this point. 2016, he lost his license. The clinic closed about a year later. The rumor is that Dr. Klopfer spent the last year of his life before he died on September 3rd sitting in the chapel praying at the Women's Care Center, the pro-life clinic across the street from the abortion clinic that he administered abortions in for years. That's the story. The staff at the Women's Care Center have said, I've read a couple different news articles that they've talked about, he was there numerous times a week, sitting in their chapel, talking to their chaplain, some of these other things, which is an interesting thing. So all of that said, they discovered in his garage or his basement, I'm not sure exactly where, 2,246 fetuses, babies' bodies. And we can assume, context clues, we can assume that each of these babies was what they would have called an intact specimen, because it didn't take very long for them to decide, A, that they were babies, and B, how many of them there were. So that tells me that they looked like babies and they were able to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and count them, as opposed to, jars of tissue that we can't quite make out what it is. Maybe it's a baby, maybe it's not a baby, we need to run some tests. They didn't run any tests. September 3rd he died. The following week, his family went onto his property, found all of the bodies, turned them over to the coroner's office, and within 3 days, the coroner had made it public that this was something that they had. And from my perspective, I perceive all of what's going on right now in the state, that there are so many people who are praying about all of these things going on with abortion in Illinois, and all of these truths are coming to light. And when we start shedding light on all these things that are happening, that's when people start changing their minds about things. I mean, 2,200 babies in a guy's basement, you can't ignore that they're babies at that point.
And what's the diocese doing?
Yeah, so the Diocese of Joliet stepped in, and the Diocese of, actually someone told me recently the Diocese of Gary was involved as well. The Diocese of Joliet and the Catholic Diocese of Gary, Indiana, they got in touch with some of the pro-life organizations in Indiana and Illinois that were all trying to pursue having these babies' bodies released to them so that they could provide them with a Christian burial. And the diocese each said, will you let us, the bishops stepped in and they said, will you let us lead that effort, and then we'll provide them with a Christian burial. That we'll work together and decide what makes the most sense. I think they recently decided that Gary, because these babies were from South Bend, the Diocese of Gary would lead that effort. So they're working with the county coroner's office right now to have, once the investigation is over, to have those babies released to them. I don't know that the county coroner's office has promised that yet, so we should all pray about that, because I think that that's an important thing. That's a corporal work of mercy, is burying the dead. So, so that's kind of what's going on there. But, I mean, to bring it back to your question, sir, I think that all of these things coming to light and us sitting down and having these conversations, that's a pretty powerful thing, and we have to perceive it as a grace-filled, truth is always a good thing. So I say let's just let her rip and watch what happens.
You're very uplifting. You're the right person.
Oh, thank you, I appreciate that very much. Thanks. Thank you. So any other questions I can answer for you? Sure.
I'm amazed that there isn't more litigation against these abortion clinics.
Yeah.
I mean, there's litigation against every physician and every hospital, and every nurse is always looking over their shoulder,
Yeah.
What did I do or not do, and who's gonna come after me next?
Yeah.
But here, it seems like they're just freewheeling, they can have filthy, dirty places,
Yeah.
Doing very aseptic work, and I'm amazed that nothing is happening.
Yeah. So the Thomas More Society is a pro-life law firm in Chicago, and they've done a lot of national pro-life work. They're putting a case together right now to fight the insurance portion of this law. I think from their perspective, they're just trying to identify what's the weakest part of the law that under current Illinois law we can actually try to fight it and have a shot. Illinois is such a tough climate because we know that we have, activist judges that we might end up with, that if we do bring a case up, it'll just be ruled in the opposite direction. And I think the fear that pro-life attorneys, dealing with these pro-life cases always have is setting a precedent that we can't go backwards from. So if we have a case that's a weak case, for example, that's the argument that a lot of people make against the heartbeat bills. The laws that have been passed in various states. In Iowa, for example, the Iowa governor signed a law that said that it was illegal in the state of Iowa to perform an abortion after the baby has a heartbeat, which is at 44 weeks. That's early. And a lot of pro-life groups themselves will condemn heartbeat laws, and I'm certainly not necessarily saying that I agree with that, but they'll condemn heartbeat laws because the fear is that they can't, that won't be upheld in court. And if it's not upheld in court and they lose, and then it sets a precedence for future cases that if they ever try to pass a law like that again, they won't be able to overturn that original precedence. And I think so. I mean, to be honest, it's one of those things, again, from my perspective, as Christians, we have to kind of let those things, let God handle those things, and we have to just pursue what we think is the truth. But it's tough. I can see why people are afraid of that. And I think for a lot of these lawyers, they're looking at the law all day long and they're thinking, how can we be as discerning as possible and hit in exactly the right piece as opposed to attacking the whole thing, which is tough. A lot of laws in Illinois, and Ralph can speak to this too, but for example, parental notification law was litigated for 15 years. So it wasn't actually even enforced until fairly recently, which is that's the frustrating part of it for me, is that we've already been through this. Why are we going through this all over again? You know, but I think it just shows how relentless they are. That we've already fought on parental notification for 15 years and we won. It's enforced. You know, as far as we know, it's enforced exactly. But I don't know. So I don't know that answers your question so much as it's a complicated thing.